As well as the string column types that we looked at in the last movie, MySQL also has some numeric column types for storing numeric data. We're going to use the same database that we created earlier on in this chapter, and let's create a sample table. Let's call it numbers, and we're going to use this to show the first numeric column type, which is called integer. Now, an integer is a whole number rather than a number with a fraction appended to it. So we're only able to store whole numbers in an integer column. Let's call our first column simply I, and that will be an integer. Now, the limits on an integer column is that the range of valid values is minus 214748368 to the same number in the positive. So quite a broad range of possible values there. So let's create one integer column there, and integer comes in a number of different sizes. So as well as the plain integer size, there's also, let's call it T for tiny int, and a tiny int is much smaller. A tiny int goes from minus 128 to 127. Then there's small int, which is a slightly larger range than tiny int, minus 32,768 to 32,767. And then there's medium int, which occupies a space between small int and int. And finally, there's big int, which is absolutely enormous for if you want to store very large numbers. We're just going to stick with tiny int for now. There's one more thing you should know about these different sizes of the integer column type, is that if you include the unsigned keyword afterwards, then the range changes. So a tiny int, instead of having a range of minus 128 to 127, unsigned, it has a range of 0 to 255. So what the unsigned means is that you're not allowed to include negative figures if the unsigned value has been specified. So essentially, the unsigned ranges of integer types allow for numbers that are twice as big as the upper limit of a signed range, but they don't allow for negative numbers. So just let's have a tiny int that is signed. In other words, we don't specify unsigned. And now we're going to have another column. We're going to call this one Z. It's going to be another integer. We're going to specify another property called zero fill. Zero fill will fill up our column any numbers, any space that's left in front of the number that we put into the column. It will fill with zeros. I'm also going to have one called n, a column called n, and that's going to be another integer, and in this one we're going to specify not null. I mentioned null values a little bit earlier on in this chapter, but now we're going to see what that actually does. If we create that table and then try inserting some values into it, so we're going to use the insert statement. Let's say we try and put the number 300 into all of these columns. We use our select statement to get back the data that we've just added. As we can see, this has been interpreted in three different ways. First of all, our integer column, the first one, has interpreted the value 300 correctly as 300. The tiny int column, however, has a range, as I mentioned earlier, of -128 to 127. Because 300 doesn't fall within that range, it goes as near to it as it can. So it goes to the upper limit of its range and it puts in that figure. The column in which we specified zero fill has added a whole load of zeros to the beginning of that number to fill up the default width of the column. The final column, in this case, acts just the same as the first to correctly interpret the number 300. Now, in order to see what the not null column does, we're going to have to specify an insert statement without inserting into all the columns. If we simply do that by saying insert into numbers values 20, say if we just wanted to fill in the first one and leave the rest blank, MySQL will give us an error. What we need to do is to use a slightly different syntax for the insert statement, where we specify in brackets after the table name the particular column or columns in which we want to enter some data. So in this case we just want to enter into one column, T. Let's use I because that's the first one. And we're going to put the value 20 into that column. This time the query works. When we take a look at the contents of our table, in the new record, the lowest one, we'll see that the number 20 was added into the first column, and then capital NULL has been put in the second two. Now this is what happens generally when we specify insert statement without mentioning one or more of the columns. So a null value is shown where no value has been placed into the column. On the last column, however, because we specified not null, it automatically fills in a 0. Now the difference between 0 and null may not be immediately obvious, and I won't go into it in this movie, but it does make quite a difference. Essentially, a null value is a value that hasn't been assigned anything, whereas a 0, although it may not seem much of a value, is still some kind of value. For instance, if you run a search for zeros, you won't find nulls in your database. They're not equivalent. In terms of string columns, you specifying not null on a column type will fill that column with an empty string rather than a null value. We'll look at the significance of this later, as I said. So that's it for integers. Integers, very simple type of data, doesn't allow fractions.